A climate change conference wraps in Germany. What were the key issues on the agenda? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Some 6,000 people attended the just concluded UN Framework Convention on Climate Change conference in Bonn, Germany. The key focus of the 10-day meeting, climate finance, as nations prepare for COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan in the fall. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres spoke about the need for wealthy countries to step up and provide critically needed funding.
Eye-watering debt repayments are drying up funds for climate action. Extortion-level capital costs are putting renewables virtually out of reach for most developing and emerging economies. At the first step, all developed countries must honor their commitment to double adaptation finance to at least $40 billion a year by 2025.
As some of the poorest countries are among those hit hardest by climate-related disasters, will developed nations be able to agree on global funding goals in November? Well, to try and answer this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Bahrain, Mahmoud is a water resources management and climate adaptation expert. From Shanghai, we're joined by Changhua, who is the chair of the Governing Council of Asia-Pacific Water Forum and China director at the office of Jeremy Rifkin. In New York, Amali Tower is the founder and executive director of Climate Refugees, a research and advocacy organization for those displaced by climate change. And from England, we're joined by Bob Ward, who is a policy and communications director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. Welcome to all of you. Bob Ward, of course, the focus at this conference in Bonn was on finance, as I'd mentioned, but there were disagreements on where the financing will come from and to whom it will go. What is your assessment of where climate finance is right now?
Well, countries have to agree by the COP on a new so-called collective quantified goal on climate finance. And this is the agreement around how much money the developed countries should be investing in developing countries. It succeeds a goal that was set in 2009 and 2010 that the rich countries should be providing $100 billion a year by 2020. The rich countries missed that target, but have just, it looks like in last year reached it. But there was an agreement that from 2025 there would be a new goal. The Arab nations and the African nations put on the table in Bonn a suggestion that the rich countries should be mobilizing between $1.1 and $1.3 trillion a year from 2025. The rich countries did not offer anything, and they are very far apart. But I should say that the numbers that the Arab countries and the African countries have put forward are in line, largely in line with the findings of the independent high-level expert group on climate finance, which has published two major reports finding that by 2030, the developing countries and the emerging market and developing countries by 2030 will need to be spending about $2.4 trillion a year on the transition and on to clean power and adaptation and loss and damage, and that about $1 trillion of that should come from external sources, the rich countries. So we're very far apart, but the developing countries are the ones who seem to be following the evidence at the moment and have made a perfectly reasonable request about what the level of support they should be receiving from the developed countries is.
So, Bob, as you say, the developed and developing countries are far apart. What would be the consequences if that money is not forthcoming?
Well, that calculation by the independent high-level expert group on climate finance was what is required to reach the Paris Agreement goals. And without that funding, we will not get it. So if the rich countries don't want to make that contribution, they have to accept that they're not trying to deliver on the Paris Agreement goals. And if we do not deliver on that, then everybody suffers. Rich countries and poor countries together will all suffer as a result of that.
Changhua Wu, the developed industrialized countries, well, they're calling the shots here as far as finance is concerned. I mean, and these are the countries that are largely responsible for the climate conditions that we find ourselves in right now. There also appears to be some mixed priorities here. I mean, the Paris Accord, as Bob pointed out to us, calls for funding from developed countries to address, what is a very serious global issue. But the climate activist, Harjit Singh, he said developed countries are looking at climate finance as another way to make money, as a money-making opportunity. So how does that complicate the funding effort?
It is complicated, and when we talk about climate finance, particularly in the context of the Paris Agreement, it's the issue of is it grants or is it loan? We all know grants is basically saying, okay, you just provide the aid to other developing countries. If it's a loan, then that means there is an interest, right? You need to pay back there as well. So fundamentally, at the essence level, it is very, very different there. I think that's part of the debate, which is not new, which has been there for a while. And if you look at this $100 billion commitment every year by 2020, which was theoretically delivered in 2022, which reached about $115 billion, 2 years delay after the target year of 2020. Now we are looking into the future. Particularly in the coming decade there, we do need, really unprecedented level of climate finance from developed countries to developing countries, not as a loan, but more importantly as grants to really help poor countries to, on one side, mitigate climate change, in the meantime, actually to adapt to the consequences of climate disasters there. So fundamentally, I think that's the debate. In terms of how the G7 or largest industrialized countries will be able to pull the money together. One, what the target that they are to commit and how the money will be put together. That's going to be very, very crucial, actually, for the result of COP29.
Right. Mohammed, Mahmoud, that $100 billion that we're talking about, as Bob Ward pointed out a moment ago, it was supposed to be there in 2020. Well, they did get there in 2022. The fact that it was 2 years late, I mean, what impact will that have at this stage on efforts by developing countries to mitigate the effects of climate change and also on the efforts to adapt?
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is the more delay we have in terms of mobilizing these funds, that sort of pushes back our ability or countries' abilities to be able to mobilize and utilize those funds to actually develop climate mitigation efforts, which is primarily the way where you want to be able to address global greenhouse gas emissions, to sort of mitigate and put a halt or slow down the warming that we're experiencing and then the consequences that come with that, but also simultaneously put into plans and action adaptation measures, especially in developing countries and the least developed countries and island nations that tend to suffer the most brunt. Unfortunately, the reality is we've been slow in terms of putting these resources in the ground. And then the other fact is, even when these resources are committed in terms of pledges for funding, there's still a lot more that has to happen before those funds actually go into work. We've seen, I'll use a simple example, this loss and damage fund, how it went back and forth, and ultimately, after much chagrin, was accepted to be under the oversight of the World Bank. Well, there's issues there in terms of developing nations concerned that may stall issues that may be influenced by the US, since that's where it will be headquartered under the World Bank. And so even when the funds are put into place, there is still multiple steps ahead in terms of putting into action, and then questions of how it will be put into action. How do you award certain projects that look at adaptation or mitigation strategies? So this delay at the very front end has much more consequential cascading effects till the ultimate point where we actually see those dollars in action.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about those issues that you talk about, Mohammed, a little later in the show. But I want to get to Amali Tower right now. Amali, great to have you with us on the show. You know, we've been talking about the effects that climate change is having on people. And there seems to be one mistaken view that this is something that's going to happen in the future. It's not happening right now. But you deal with a very specific impact that it's having on people who are forced to move, people who are displaced, climate refugees. What are you seeing right now?
Yeah, it's great to be back. Thank you for having me. You're absolutely right. I think we need to bring this into the human impacts, the human consequences of the inaction and the woeful climate finance situation we're in. You know, Bonn may have just ended, but we also know that forcible displacement has reached another record of 120 million people displaced all around the world today. Those are refugees, internally displaced people, and climate is increasingly playing a major role. 3 in 4 people now live in who are forcibly displaced live in climate vulnerable countries. This is happening in the south to the countries that have contributed the least but are impacted the most. I've also just returned from Central America, where I've spoken to migrants, returned migrants, forcibly displaced populations, and everywhere I went, the things that I heard can be encapsulated as following. We don't want to leave our home, but we are being forced to leave our home because of climate change. And that is reflective of the over 10-year drought in the dry corridor. That is reflective of twin hurricanes that were devastated the region, Hurricanes Eta and Iota, which are now a few years ago. But the impacts and the effects of that linger. They continue. People are being pushed into poverty. They have issues with land rights. They don't have the inputs to actually get the agricultural yields they need. These are small landholder farmers who are subsistence farmers. So is it any wonder that you're seeing increasing migration to the U.S. southern border, and the finance isn't coming, and neither are the migration strategies that really take into account the role that climate change now plays?
Right, and Amali, and looking at some of the efforts being made, I mean, there's something called the debt for climate swaps. These are kind of agreements to help countries restructure their debt into savings. I mean, it's an effort to combat climate change, but how does that work?
Yeah, well, everyone's spoken a bit about the 100 billion, right, that was supposed to come. So in 2022, let's look at that. 69% of that 115.9 billion are loans and not grants, and that's at market interest rates. So how on earth do I just told you stories of what's happening in Central America, in Somalia, where there are regions that aren't affected by conflict. I was told 2 years ago when I was there, we don't have conflict here, only climate change. Over 1.4 million people are displaced from the drought in the Horn of Africa. So countries like this are on the receiving ends of these very immoral climate finance coming in the form of loans. We know already that this is a disastrous way forward. Think about the AIDS pandemic and sub-Saharan Africa, and how countries had all this conditionality given to them from World Bank and IMF loans. And we all know what the human rights impacts of all of those things were. Education plummeted. Women, gender rights went all in the wrong direction. Healthcare systems were nationalized. Education, had to, or rather went from nationalized to privatized, So it erodes rights. And I think we have to think about the climate crisis, loss and damage, and all of these terms that are sort of technical and very kind of clean as human rights harms. This is exactly what this looks like, and I'll just say lastly too, Anand, that if we're only talking about people once they're displaced, you're already too late. You need to be looking at the losses, the development setbacks, everything that the whole world is sort of losing, and that we're going in the wrong direction, which underpin displacement. So debt for swaps is fair. I guess lastly to come back to your original question, small island developing states, that's a good example of the problems with the systemic structure here. Many of these islands are considered middle income countries who may not qualify for the grant-based finance. So you might be getting loans where it's considered that there will be some kind of earning capacity, in the projects that come forth from these. I think this is a very flawed way of looking at it, and is completely devoid of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities that developed countries have towards developing countries now.
Bob, I want to get back to, well, it's a technical term again, the Loss and Damage Fund, which became operational at COP28. This is a fund that provides help to countries that are climate vulnerable. Now, there are many people who have expressed concerns over how this fund is run. It is the World Bank that is in charge of this fund, and the concerns have been expressed over the rising costs of maintaining this fund. And of course, developed countries are under no obligation to contribute to the fund. I mean, can the current system continue to work this way?
Well, it was indeed a breakthrough to establish the Loss and Damage Fund and to operationalize it. It certainly is controversial that the World Bank, at least for the time being, is going to be the host for this. But the level of funding that needs to go into it needs to be much bigger than is currently flowing. And remember, loss and damage is essentially money that goes to the developing countries to help them deal with those disasters that they cannot avoid through adaptation and other methods. Now, the real value of this is that it should mobilize payments very quickly so that countries can recover quickly from disasters, because we know from our experience with natural disasters that if you do not have a rapid response at scale, that disasters essentially become even worse. You can get, for instance, in the aftermath of a disaster, breakdowns in public health, the spread of disease. You can cause real long-term damage. So it's very necessary to establish this, but we must remember that the reason we're having to spend increasing amounts on this is because we have failed as a world to reduce our emissions quickly enough and to avoid the level of damage that we're seeing. And that damage is only going to get worse. The poorest countries are least capable of dealing with this because they are poorer. Many of the countries that we're talking about also have huge levels of debt at the moment, a lot of which is accumulated since the pandemic. Yep. And so it's all going to get worse. And it comes back to the fundamental economics of this. It is far more costly to deal with the consequences of climate change than it is to avoid climate change happening in the first place by cutting our emissions of greenhouse gases.
Changhua, another term that we hear very often is energy transition. That's another important issue. At COP28, nations agreed to move away from fossil fuels. That was part of the global stocktake, also known as the GST. Now, the first ever global GST dialogue took place in Bonn. What do we know about the global stocktake?
I think we already have the data evidence before COP28, after the first global stocktaking was completed. And that pretty much has become an important foundation for all the negotiations, level of ambitions to fight climate change, as well as climate finance goals, among others, there for the coming decade there. So we sort of know the gap in terms of mitigation, of course, including adaptation there. And we all know we need, more climate finance to be put on the table into the process from developed countries to developing countries in order for them to fight climate change and adapt to the climate consequences or disasters there as well. So Bonn, definitely, I think that's the tone set already. But if you look at the process, we all realize actually it continues to be a challenging process to progress. To cite Simon Steele, the UNFCCC Executive Secretary General, basically saying, modest progress made so far, but there is a steep mountain to climb as well. We are already in June, and the COP29 will be in November. So in the next few months, to what extent we'll be able to really bridge that gap, to overcome the hurdles, to really reach something meaningful, the outcome, document for COP29 remains to be seen. I think we needed to pay more attention to the core issues, particularly the how-to part. We're talking about finance, climate finance there. I know there are solutions there. There are challenges there. Debt swamp definitely for climate. That's one thing. If you look at IMF, the special drawing rights is also on the table. That could offer some help. But very importantly, we need multinational development banks in particular to step up their efforts and really to help solve the problem.
Mohammed, there were also discussions on the Global Goal on Adaptation, or CGA. I'm sorry that these discussions are replete with jargon like this, technical terms, but the plan is to measure progress on CGA. What kind of progress has there been?
I think the reality, and this was a point that came up in discussion with my fellow, conversation right now with the fellow panelists, is we're so behind the 8 ball in terms of getting things done. I mean, climate financing is one of it, implementing adaptation strategies and projects, similarly mitigation measures, that by the time we make the sufficient progress to either begin to get close to adequately financed or begin to mobilize projects in more vulnerable parts of the world, certainly more so in the developing part of the world, things are getting worse. I mean, look at how things have amplified between last year and now we're beginning the summer in terms of warming. And as we know, summer brings out the worst in terms of climate impacts. So every time we catch up to where we think we should be, the time has moved on, where things have amplified even worse. So with respect to the adaptation goal, the global goal on adaptation, it's a similar effect. We're seeing slowly more evidence of accelerating sea level rise impacts. We talked about the island nations in earlier conversation. Similarly, in terms of impacts to drought for water resources, and then that has a cascading effect for food security and food production. Warming in and of itself, just extreme temperatures from a public health perspective. And similarly, when we think about warming of the oceans, that has generated a lot of storms. Look back a couple of months ago at this point, the storms that hit the Arabian Peninsula, completely out of season, as we expect those types of storms to happen later in the summer and beginning of the fall. So we're always behind in terms of getting things done compared to where it needs to be. And so I unfortunately see that being a trend moving forward unless we accelerate action and get really serious about doing something in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation.
Amali Tower, Co Barrett, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization, this is what she had to say about current climate conditions. Let's listen.
As our planet enters this new record-breaking era, we can expect to see more oppressive heat waves affecting the health of billions of people, more increases in marine heat waves, jeopardizing livelihoods and natural ecosystems along our coasts, more sea level rise threatening coastal populations everywhere, more intense rainfall events pushing our infrastructure beyond its limits. The future scenarios many of us have feared are here now.
So, Molly, listening to what Co Barrett had to say there, I mean, it's very alarming. And I just want to get back to a point that Bob Ward mentioned a moment ago. I mean, do you find that there is a recognition on the part of developed countries especially that it's going to be far more expensive, as Bob pointed out, to deal with the consequences of climate change rather than to avoid it in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, Bob's right, and we've heard that a lot before. I think that there is a recognition of that because it's pretty hard to deny it. I don't think that recognition is translating into any kind of action, and I think that might have a lot to do with the fact that there's a reticence to commit to a change in systems, a change in like the status quo, in how we've sort of gone about things. I also think that there's a belief that tech and development are somehow going to like see our way out of the climate crisis. There's not a lot of thought into, is the tech, are all the sort of innovations that are available, is that shared? Is that equitable? Is that available to everybody? It isn't, and that's also something that the Global South countries have long, argued and asked for and lamented at various forums, not just in the UN climate talks, to bring Co Barrett's point to really to bear. Think about this. I told you 120 million people are forcibly displaced, right? That's the brand new number as of the 13th of June. Climate change is exacerbating risks to displaced people every single day. Just this month, right, a few days ago, 80 asylum seekers, refugees, mostly Sudanese, died because of the heat wave that is ongoing right now in the Middle East and North Africa. Aswan hit 50 degrees Celsius while fleeing to try and seek asylum in Egypt. Sudanese refugees died. Think about that. They are fleeing a war, and in the process of trying to seek protection, they're dying because of the climate crisis. It is very much here, and I could not agree more with what Colbert just had to say. So I don't know what it's going to take to get people to recognize this. A lived experience on their own soil is where we have seen traditionally, things start to shift. And the fact that most of the worst of the climate crisis is borne by people who contributed nothing and in the global south, and yet all the power and the solutions and the money still lies in the global north, is an asymmetry that we have to challenge every single day.
Bob, COP29 will take place in November, as I said, in Azerbaijan. What are your expectations of over the next few months in the run-up to that conference?
Well, we're going to need to see governments really focus now on delivery. I mean, we've run out of time. We've been too slow, and now we're dealing with a lot of consequences. We do need the agreement on the collective goal, but the really crucial thing is next year, countries have to come forward with revised emission reductions targets that have to put us back on target to try and avoid the worst consequences of climate change. Because at the moment, the global stocktake that was undertaken at the last COP showed that we're way off target. We're nowhere near being consistent with the emissions reductions we need. And remember, climate change gets worse until the world gets to net zero emissions of greenhouse gases. At the moment, annual emissions are going up every year. We're way beyond it, and the world is just simply not taking enough notice of the mounting evidence of suffering, of damage to lives and livelihoods all around the world. And things are going to get much, much worse until we all take this a lot more seriously.
And that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. So that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.
Thanks, George.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global business, only on CGTN.